and get started in prayer. And the prayer tonight that I'm going to open with is the Suscipe by St. Ignatius of Loyola. It's a great prayer to pray before you study, before you read, before anything like that involves your mind. So, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will, all that I have and possess. You have given all to me. To you, O Lord, now I return it. All is yours. Dispose of me wholly according to your will. Give me only your love and your grace, for this is enough for me. St. Ignatius, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So tonight is the Theology of the Body, the first session, the meaning of life, and other easy questions. As you'll see this evening, that we're going to tackle a whole lot. And it begins a lot with the person of John Paul II. It's really his vision that we are going to kind of enter into and look through. The lens of John Paul II, how we're going to look at God's original plan for love and for life. How does he see it? And to kind of put it in perspective, John Paul II wrote more on marriage and human sexuality than any other pope. And in the 20th century, more was written on the subject than the past 1900 centuries combined. And so it's something that we've really strived to understand as a church. And John Paul II was key. He was one of the most prominent figures in bringing the church's teaching to light and to put it in a very positive way. So it's good to understand something about the person of John Paul II. He was born on May 18th, 1920 in Wajowice, Poland, which is only about 20 miles from Auschwitz and Birkenau, the concentration camps where Hitler began exterminating Jews, Catholics, Gypsies, and all sorts of other people. So when we get into this, we could see how this affected him. He was the youngest of 3 children. His mother, Amelia, died during childbirth when he was 8. Older sister, Olga, she died before he was born. And his brother, Edmund, died in 1938 from scarlet fever. His father, also named Carol, died in 1941. So as a young man, 21 years old, he has no family left. And so you'll see, you see a lot of this beauty comes out in his explanation of, he has an entire catechesis on God the Father. And it's strikingly beautiful because he has this experience of being kind of orphaned in a way. In October 1942, he goes into the seminary. John Paul II witnessed the effects of both Nazism and communism. Nazism saw Jews as less than human, and this was very prominent in a lot of their writings. Communism had a utilitarian view of the human person, that the person is good and valuable insofar as they benefit the state. So a person is simply another tool. How can it benefit the state? How can it help keep everything working together? It's a very kind of usury way to view the human person. And both of these had tremendous effects on the person of Pope John Paul II. Mikhail Gorbachev said later on, after the Iron Curtain fell, he said that it would have been impossible for that to happen. For the fall of communism, it would have been impossible had it not been for Pope John Paul II. And so I really think between Pope John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, those two together really helped bring down communism. And in God's great omni-humorous view, I guess, he chose 2 actors, both Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II, who was a playwright. He did tremendous plays. There's a couple of them that are now published and stuff. He was an actor, loved the theater. Same with Ronald Reagan. He used these 2 figures to bring down communism. And later on, we'll also talk about, or in the next slide, we'll talk about his. There were 3 assassination attempts on him, and one of them, in which it was just confirmed in 2006 that the Soviet Union was behind one of the assassination attempts on John Paul II, the one in 1981. That the Soviet Union was behind it, and so we see from the very beginning that John Paul II, by witnessing these 2 horrible regimes of both Nazism and communism, that it does tremendous damage to society. Why? Because it's based on a false philosophy, a false understanding of what the human person is. And so I just want to read quickly. This is Witness to Hope. It's the short biography by George Weigel on the life of Pope John Paul II. And when Pope John Paul II was growing up, when he was going to seminary and stuff, for 4 years he worked in a rock quarry. And he worked alongside all different types of people. And this is what George Weigel talks about at the time. He says, although there were some rough customers among them, what struck the young Wojtyła most about these men was their innate dignity, which expressed itself in friendliness and a willingness to help others despite their own hard circumstances. Thanks to 4 years of breaking rocks at the quarry and hauling buckets of lime, Carol knew these men, their living situations, their families, their interests, their human worth from inside. From that inside perspective, the young rockbreaker began to think more deeply about the meaning of work itself. The Catholic piety with which he had grown up held the backbreaking work, which was one of the curses of original sin, one of the enduring punishments of Adam and Eve's defiance of God. His experience of the quarry eventually led Wojtyła to a different view. Work, with all its rigor and hardships, was a participation in God's creativity, because work touched the very essence of the human being as the creature to whom God had given dominion over the earth. And so this was when he was still in seminary. And so from the very beginning, Wojtyła was faced with looking very deeply at who is a human person. Where does their worth come from? How is it that they are all different, but we're all from the same God? And so a lot of it goes back to creation. A lot of it goes back to that first book in Genesis, which is where he begins his theology of the body. He was elected Pope on October 16, 1978. And like I said, during his papacy of about 26 years, he survived 3 assassination attempts. One on May 13, 1981 by Mehmet Ali Aka, where he was shot in St. Peter's Square. And this was the one that they confirmed that the Soviet Union was behind. May 12th, 1982, so almost 1 day short of a year later, a man tried to stab John Paul II with a bayonet, but he was stopped by security guards, and they later said that John Paul II had been injured during the attempt but managed to hide his non-life-threatening wound. And that was done by a priest who was later removed from the priesthood and had some mental problems that they sent him off to deal with. And so that was only a year later. And then in 1995, this one was called the Bojinka plot, and it was started by Al-Qaeda and an Al-Qaeda-funded group. Ramzi Youssef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's been in the news the past several years, they were kind of the masterminds behind this plot, and the plot consisted of John Paul II was going to the Philippines for World Youth Day. And so when he was going to go to the Philippines, they were going to have a bomber or several dress up as priests and try to get very close to the Pope's motorcade as it passed by. When they would get close, they would detonate the bombs, killing the Pope. This would all serve as a distraction so that there would be other hijackers that would hijack 11 planes and crash them in the United States and other targets like that. A week before this was supposed to go down, a chemical fire broke out where they were setting all this up, and they captured some of the people, and the plot was foiled and never went through. But only a week. I mean, yeah, so close. That they managed to foil this plot. So, and I think a lot of it has to do because he was such an outspoken advocate for the dignity of every human person, of every human life, from beginning of conception to natural death. And so much of this work began with his upbringing. A lot of it came to kind of flourish in a book that he wrote in the late 1950s. It was published in 1960, called Love and Responsibility. It's a very dense philosophical book, but it's really good. An easier book would be, there's a guy named Edward Shree, and he wrote a book hitting the highlights of love and responsibility. And this book was really kind of the foundation for the theology of the body. What was behind it? How is it going to set the stage? And so he was elected Pope in 1978, and in 1979 he began delivering his Wednesday addresses there at St. Peter's. So from 1979 to 1984 he delivered 129 Wednesday audiences, which were then collected and put into a book. This is the old version. Put into a book called The Theology of the Body. And the Pope begins by looking to the person of Christ. And we'll see, keep that in the back of your mind, that he begins with the person of Christ. He begins by pointing back to creation. This all plays into effect. The theology of the body itself has grown tremendously in being acknowledged, not only here in America, but around the world. There's several institutes that are really dedicated to understanding his theology of the body. Here, our goal is to very briefly touch on all of these topics so that we're somewhat familiar with understanding that all of the Church's teachings on human sexuality are based on the dignity of the human person. When you understand who the human person is, the Church's teachings make sense. You will also see that the Catholic Church is the only Christian church with a consistent sexual ethic. No other church is consistent in that same way. And so, to touch on a very brief historical note, every single Christian denomination was against contraception up until 1930, when at the Lambeth Conference in England, the Anglican Church decided to allow contraception in a particular case. A few years before that, they had come out and they said that contraception was objectively wrong. Then they allowed it in this one case. Then a couple of years later, they just said it's okay to use contraception. It is responsible to use contraception. And so it was that small little opening. Once they opened that gap, and now we can see kind of what's happened to the Anglican Church or the Episcopalian Church here in America. They've suffered greatly because that sexual ethic, that moral law was not held in its integrity. And so we'll see this in the Church's teaching, that is the only one that's consistent. And so for the Pope, no question is too big. How does man image God? Remember, if we're looking to understand marriage, human sexuality, we need to understand who the human person is. And so he says, how does man image God? Is it in the soul? Is it in the body? Is it in both? If so, how? What was it like in the beginning? What was God's original plan for life? No question is too big for the Pope. He seeks to understand the meaning of life. And we can understand the reasoning of his questioning in this way. Man is created in the image and likeness of God. That means every human person images God in some way. The human person is both a body and a soul. Not one or the other, but it is both. And so the imaging of God is not only in the soul, but it is also in the body and in the deepest desires of every human person. The meaning of life is fulfilled in the Creator, the one who gave life. And the way you ask the artist, what is the meaning of a painting? Show me all the aspects of the painting, the hidden aspects that you put in there. The sometimes lost aspects of a particular painting. Only the author can tell you where those are, what they mean. In the same way, we look to God the Father, we look to Jesus Christ for that, because He's the author of our life and of all human life. And we find out who we truly are in the Trinity, and in particular in the person of Jesus Christ, who became one of us. And that's where we really see that fullness. The Pope once wrote in one of his encyclicals, Redemptoris Hominis, he said, "Man cannot live without love. He remains a being that is incomprehensible to himself." He can't even understand himself, the Pope is saying, if love is not revealed to him. If he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own, if he does not participate intimately in it, they cannot live. The human person cannot live without love. If you ever get a chance, I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix, there was a short documentary called The Human Experience. And it was some guys who, they did this documentary, and they the whole kind of premise behind it was that they were going to literally put themselves in other people's shoes. And so they went and they spent some time being homeless and what that was like, sleeping on the streets. And they went to all these different places throughout the world. And one of them that they went to, spoiler alert, one of them that they went to was a leprosy village, where they still exist. And he went into this village that's completely isolated from all outsiders, except those bringing, medicine, food, water, things like that, nurses. And so he goes to this village, and they were just flabbergasted at the level of happiness of these people. I mean, some of them, parts of their faces, their entire bodies were gone. And yet they loved each other greatly. And the people doing the documentary were just, they were utterly speechless. They didn't know how to react to this in a place where there was this great suffering, because they were in a community together, because they had that communion of love. They understood each other. They had something to share. They shared, accepted each other, things like that. That love made everything seem meaningless. That love was the highest priority that the human person desires, that the human person knows to be true. And we all know. We can all attest to these. If you're sitting here just kind of going like this, that's great. This should be. And I think a lot of what Pope John Paul II does in the Theology of the Body, it's not necessarily, while it is very intense and deep, it's not always the most rude awakening, or, wow, I didn't know that. A lot of this is going to be affirmation in our deepest desires and what we've kind of known to be true, but we weren't really sure how to put it, how to express it. And so I think the Pope does a great job of doing that. And Redemptoris Hominis, he says that the human person needs love to live. And lastly, he continues, he says, it is Jesus Christ who fully reveals man to himself. And so what he means by that, and that was something that was from Vatican II, talking about that it is the person of Christ who fully reveals man to himself. If you want to know who you are, look to the person of Christ. Why? Because he's both God and man. He's both, he is the creator, but he became like us. He lowered himself to become like us in everything except for sin, so that he could bring us back to the Father, to reconcile us. So he knows deeply, intimately, what it means to be a human person. Not only because he's the author of it, but because he became one of us. He, like the authors of that documentary, he walked, he came and stood in our shoes. He came and stood in our sin and said, don't worry, this is not the end. I will reconcile you to the Father. You have a Father, and he still loves you. And so much of this is about love, and it's about life. So, this is all, I think, kind of providential in that the theology of the body has gained great momentum in the past 10, 15 years or so. And I think a lot of it is because of the times that we're living in. We right now in our country, we're having the whole marriage debate. What does it mean to be married? What is marriage? Between a man and a woman, 2 men, 2 women, 3, 4, what is it? And so I was just kind of looking up online on how just different ways that people see life or how they can fix life themselves. And so one of them, how to change your life in 7 steps. We very much like steps in fixing things. Life isn't about finding yourself. Life is about creating yourself. And so we can see kind of how in our society also that we don't necessarily look. What did John Paul II just said? If you want to understand who you are, look to the person of Christ. Whereas kind of the voice coming from our modern culture is, create yourself. You don't need the creator. Nobody determines who you are. You determine who you are. And this is one of my favorite. Life is how we define it. Who is the measure of truth? Is truth something that we look at and we say, this is true? I will define this as true. I will define this as not true. Or is it something that we recognize? This is true, not because I say it is true, but because it is true. And so, the same with life. Life, just define it however you want. And the best attitude towards life, yes, I have made lots of mistakes in my life, because life doesn't come with the user's manual. With the user manual. My life, my way, my rules. Again, kind of that understanding of we're all dealt a hand, and we just play it the best we can, and it doesn't matter. My rules, it's my hand. And so it's kind of this very misunderstanding of freedom. That freedom is not necessarily the ability to choose the good, the ability to choose God. But it's this kind of autonomy that I define. Not only can I just not choose good, but I can define what is good and what is not good. And so this creates a big problem as we see. Especially, when you think about the marriage debate, is marriage something that is defined by the state? Or was it originally something that the state recognized as good for the society? Where did the meaning of marriage come from first? Did the state give it its meaning? Or did the state recognize it and say, this is good for our society because our future members of the society come from this union. We are going to recognize it and we are going to promote it because it is good for the state. So right there from the beginning, we can see how these two conflicting views are going to butt heads. Is it something that we recognize or is it something that we ourselves define? And so much of what we're going to talk about is, in order to understand life, we have to understand the human person. In order to understand human sexuality, we have to understand what? The human person. So much comes from our understanding of who the human person is. And to understand that, we have to understand, we have to go back to creation. What happens when we don't understand who the human person is? This guy. That's a direct quote from Richard Dawkins. He's a famous atheist, evolutionary biologist. He's an Oxford University professor and author. And so he said an adult pig is more human than a human fetus. And then somebody conveniently wrote, I forgot how to science. So I thought it was quite, what a ridiculous statement. That a pig is more human than a human fetus. This is what happens when we not only throw God out of it, but we start to define things. When we become the absolute measure of everything. And so, to understand what life is about, we must understand first who the human person is. I know I've said that like 12 times by now, but it's something that evidently even the most learned people don't always get. And so that's kind of what our job here is to look at. And so for John Paul II, and the book that we're using as our model to understand and study the theology of the body is The Men and Women Are from Eden. And this is how the book is outlined. We're going to look at original man tonight, historical man next week, which is man throughout history. So from the first part will be, what was it like before the fall? Original man. The second part, we're going to look at historical man. What was it like after the fall and throughout history? Third, we're going to look at eschatological man. It's a big word. You can impress your friends and family at Thanksgiving with that word. Eschatological man, which is man's final end. What is man? What is the ultimate goal of man? And then Father Braun, I believe, will be coming in to talk about celibacy and celibacy for the kingdom. How does that play into human sexuality and also the role of the human person? Father McLaughlin will be here to discuss the sacrament of marriage. And then the final session will be divided. Allison will teach part of it on love and fruitfulness and marital love. And then the Todds, who are the parish NFP coaches, they will also be here to talk about that marital love, that it is a unique kind of love. And to realize, and we can understand from the very beginning, there are different kinds of love. And that's something that our society, again, something that's super pressing. For those of you young folks, if you've been on Facebook, everybody has those equal signs up, and they have their slogan, love is love, and that's their kind of defense of gay marriage. Love is love. Well, no, there's different kinds of love. I love my dog. I love a book. I love my mom. I love my wife. I love Deacon Staling. He's a good friend. I love him. All different kinds of love. And so hopefully a lot of what we're going to talk about will be able to help us not only recognize the church's teaching and the truth in it, but also to help us kind of look at all the different voices that are coming at us and saying, wait a second, why are you saying that? There's a flaw in your argument. There's a flaw in your thinking there, that something's not adding up right. You need to think about it for more than 5 seconds before you decide to repost something kind of very ignorant. How does the Pope go about this? And so here we're going to get into two huge words that are probably not particularly important, but they are a good way to understand how the Pope approaches this understanding of the theology of the body. It's what's called phenomenological personalism. Again, impress your friends at Thanksgiving. Phenomenology, it's a philosophical method used to explain the truth of things beginning with experience. So the root word there is phenomena. So beginning with the experience of something. And so that's kind of the philosophical method that he is going to use, is to begin with experience, begin with the human experience. And as we'll see, he begins with the experience of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, specifically. Second part of that is personalism. And it's a philosophy that attempts to explain the uniqueness of the human person in nature. We recognize that the human person is unlike any other creature out there. The human person is so unique. Each one of us is unrepeatable. And so that right there screams something about the nature of the human person. Personalism kind of focuses in on that. And kind of, as it explains everything else, it's explaining all of those things in relation to the human person. And so to put them all together, we have phenomenological personalism, which is to understand the truth of the human person by seeking to understand the human experience. Specifically, we look to the human experience as it is given to us in Scripture and as it is pointed out by Jesus Christ. And I'd like to just make one side note that this is very different than kind of an anthropocentrism, which means that man is the center of the universe. So even though we are focusing on the uniqueness of the human person, we are focusing on the uniqueness of the human person in relation to God. We are not saying that the human person is so unique that he is divorced from God and does not need God, and that he is the measure of all truth and he is the measure of everything. But we are saying, let us look at the human person, beginning with his experience in relation to God. And so we must kind of keep that balance. Anthropocentrism is not phenomenology. John Paul II reflects especially on man before the fall, what it was like in the beginning. This is the key to understanding ourselves as Christians. We have clues to what it was like before the fall, and we know what it was like through for the first 2 and 3 chapters of the book of Genesis. So back to the beginning. Matthew 19:3. This is where the Pope begins his theology of the body. And so, kind of just on a side note, if you do pick up a copy of the Theology of the Body, I think you can even get the individual Wednesday audiences. I believe you can get them online on the Vatican website for free. But you can also pick up a handy book. There's a newer edition that came out that's a better translation than the one I have here. But he begins going back to Jesus. He begins with Jesus, and his particular meditation is on Jesus when he talks to the Pharisees. And it says, "And the Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?' He answered, 'Have you not read that he who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder.' They said to him, 'Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?' He said to them, 'For your hardness of heart Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so.'" And so that particular passage right there struck John Paul II and drove home this entire meditation. This is essentially what this is 129 short homilies. This is kind of his meditation on this. From the beginning it was not so. And so he begins there by saying, well, what was it like in the beginning? If Jesus is saying, no, Moses did that out of the hardness of your hearts. Because of sin, Moses allowed that. Moses didn't say it was good. Moses allowed that. But he's saying, I'm calling you to something higher. From the beginning, we have to begin. And so we go back before the fall to a very small, when you look at the Bible as a whole, to a very small couple of chapters in the book of Genesis. So in order to understand why Christ had to come, in order to understand why we needed Christ, the person of the Redeemer, we must understand what was lost and what had to be redeemed. Creation. We have, this is how the first 3 chapters kind of break down. And tonight we're only going to talk about the first 2 chapters. And the way they're broken up is they are two different creation accounts. You have Genesis 1, which is referred to as the Elohist creation account, and Genesis 2, which is the Yahwist creation account. Genesis 1, that's where we have the 6 days of creation, and on the seventh day God rested, and it was good that He created everything. God said, let there be light, and all these things that we study very clearly in first grade. This can be seen as the objective elements of creation. In essence, God's saying, here is how creation happened. The Genesis 2 creation account can be seen as the inner subjective experience of man in creation. And by man, I mean both male and female, kind of the generic. And so the Yahwist creation account, where God puts Adam into a deep sleep, takes a rib from his side, creates Eve, this can be seen as man's inner experience. And so here we have two, from the outset, and a lot of people, point out, you have two creation accounts. Well, which one's true? They're both true. Why? Because they're looking at two different aspects. The first one is looking at how did creation happen? How did God create? The second one is looking at what was man's experience of that? How did man experience creation? And how did man see the other? What was it like in the beginning? And so the Yahwist account, we can learn a lot from the original experience of man and woman from this story. We can also take a glimpse into the genius of creation as reflecting in the Trinity. That in Genesis 2:18, it talks. I apologize. I left my Bible in my office. But Genesis 2, and this is a picture here of Adam being cast into the deep sleep, Eve coming forth from the rib of Adam. And so in that creation account, in the first one we read all this, God created this and it was good, God created this and it was good, God created that. And then we read that Adam realized that he was alone and it was not good. And so for the first time in creation, we see something as not good. Now, is it God's fault? No. But something is missing. This is what's referred to as the original solitude of Adam. And so in this creation account, God creates all the earth, the plants, the animals, and He gives Adam the task of naming all the animals. And you can see, now you can look back and you can see how Adam got tired, because he started with hippopotamus, rhinoceros. And by the end, he was just going cow, fox, deer. So you can see how, you can see, yes, a human person did name all the animals at one time, because he got really tired. But from there, the part that was not good was that Adam looked at everything, and he saw that he was alone. He saw that he was different than the animals. He saw that he had a different relationship with God than the animals did. And so this original solitude of Adam kind of brought him to long for something, to see something. Why would Adam feel that? Why would Adam feel that? Anybody know? Right, there's no persons. And we can see that from the beginning, and this is one of those from the beginning statements. From the beginning, man was created for communion. That we were not created to live in this solitude. We were not created to sit there and each of us define our own things. But we were created for each other. We were created for communion. One of the things that we can understand from this is kind of the fault of consumerism, is the idea that if I get this one thing, I will be happy. Well, from the beginning, we see that we're made for other people. And so when we put those things in place of those people, we can see very quickly that we will never be satisfied in things. Why? Because we were made for communion with other people. Huge difference. A thing can never take the place of a human person. And so, from the beginning, we can see this. We were created for that communion. Not only were we created for communion with others, but male and female were created for union. And this communion is not a self-defined subjective experience to seek out. In other words, what we're saying is that this experience of union is not just something that we say, well, I like this makes me feel good, therefore I want to be in union with that. No, again, it's something not that we define, but it's something that we recognize. And so when Adam and Eve looked at each other, their bodies made sense together. And so it's like one of the key points from Pope John Paul II's Theology of the Body is that the very first premise, the very first foundational point that we are made for union, we are made for communion, is intimately stamped in our bodies. I mean, the male body does not make sense without the female body, and vice versa. And so it's in our body, and that's why we could say there's an actual theology of the body, because that desire for communion, that desire for intimate union, is stamped in our bodies. And we can see that we image the Trinity in this way. How is the Trinity a communion of persons? Well, the Father gives absolutely everything He has to His Son, except for His fatherhood, that relation. They will always remain distinct. But He gives everything He has to His Son. The Son accepts the gift of the Father, and like He lived out on earth in perfect obedience, gave and offered everything back to the Father. That love that exists between them is a third person, the Holy Spirit. We can see this in the human family. A husband gives everything he has to his wife. She receives it. She returns it all back to him. And from that love, as one person says, 9 months later you have to give that love a name. And so you can see how that we were created for union, not just in our desires, not just in our souls, but in our bodies. Why? Because we're not this kind of dichotomy of the two, but we are this complex image of God. It's not something that can be understood easily. And so what that original solitude was discovered in Adam was that he was not meant to be alone, that he was meant to be in communion. He found that communion in Eve, and through that giving of himself, he found meaning. And so the key point to life, the key point to Pope John Paul II's Theology of the Body is what he calls the nuptial meaning of the body, that we find meaning through a sincere gift of ourself. And we can see this. I used to take high schoolers on mission trips during the summer. And we would get back from the mission trips, and they would just be, like they couldn't describe the amazing experience that they had. They just couldn't describe it. They had never felt so intense, so alive, some of them said. And they slept on floors like this for, 5 or 6 nights and ate horrible food and Uncrustables every day and just very horrible things. But they said they never felt, and I asked them, why? And they were like, I don't know. It was just, they had trouble explaining it. I can tell you why. It's because they made an actual gift of themselves. They didn't just go there and give these people money. They didn't just go there and hand out food or do this. They participated. They actually gave of themselves. And through that giving of yourself, you find meaning. And what's the best example of that? The person of Christ. Again, we look to Christ for that. And so, He gave absolutely everything. He poured out everything. And we're called to image that. And that's where we find our meaning. Suffering. It's a great example. Suffering really doesn't make sense without the cross. And so when we look to understand suffering, when we look to see if our suffering has meaning, we can easily look to the cross. Is it easily understandable? No. But is there meaning to it? Yes. And where do we find that? In the person of Jesus Christ. Not something that we define, but something that we can discover. The union of man and women, that it's important to recognize that masculinity and femininity are complementary. They are not opposed to each other. And I'm going to read from a small section, and this is from the Pope's writing. He writes, Femininity finds itself, in a sense, in the presence of masculinity, while masculinity is confirmed through femininity. Precisely the function of sex, which is, in a sense, a constituent part of the person, not just an attribute, but a constitutive part, proves how deeply man, with all his spiritual solitude, with the never-to-be-repeated uniqueness of his person, is constituted by the body as he or she. In other words, the way that God has designed it from the beginning, and we can see this in the creation accounts in Genesis, is that he's saying, I created man, male and female, I created them. That's how Genesis puts it. It doesn't say, I just created males and females. He says, I created man, male and female, I created them. Let us make man in our image, male and female, he created them. That, from the beginning, they were meant to be together. From the beginning, they made sense together in union. Man is a body and soul. So remember, if we want to understand human sexuality, we go back to the human person. And so, what is the human person? And if any of you went to the heresies class, you saw that there was dualism. A lot of people, they would overemphasize the body or de-emphasize the body, say, well, just everything is absolutely a sin. Procreation is a sin. So the only reason why we procreate is just for the survival of the species. But other than that, it is merely sinful. And so, but no. The Pope says, in a long line of understanding the Church's teaching, that man is both body and soul. And for us that, like some of the modern TV shows, that's why zombies are scary. Why? Because they're kind of this body walking around, but without a soul. And that's why they can, Rick and all the guys can take care of them. Zombies are scary. Why? Because it's half of a person. It's just the body. But why are ghosts scary? Well, it's the other half. They're just the spirit, kind of floating around without a body. They can go through walls and all this weird stuff. So we see that very much in our literature and in our media, that the human person is both. The human person is both the body and the soul. When you separate the two, you get very scary things. The soul, and when we talk about that man is a body and a soul, we're not saying that very clearly. We have to understand that the soul is not in some way trapped in the body. That it's not like a ghost in the machine or the imprisoned soul in the body. Nor are we the same as animals who simply follow their instincts. We are more than just the highest animal or anything like that, as some people say. And we're even higher above pigs as well. We cannot be reduced to both the physical world being made because we were made in the image and likeness of God. And so we can't just say our only existence is finding meaning here on earth. Our only existence makes sense here on earth. Why? Because we were made in the image and likeness of God. We are uniquely different than any other aspect of creation, than any other aspect of life. Our bodies reveal our souls. And this is where so we understand ourselves as both body and soul. But how do they interact? Like we said, the soul is not entrapped in the body, but the body reveals the soul. Right now, my body is making known to you what's in my soul, what's in my mind. All these things are happening in and through my body. I'm doing very teacher-like gestures right now through my body. Why? Because I'm trying to get a point across. So all these things are happening in my soul. They are being communicated through my body. You understand me. You hear me through your ears. You understand me, and through that interaction of the body and the soul. The senses play an important part in that. And so again, the Pope writes, "The body and it alone is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. It was created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden since time immemorial, and God, and thus be a sign of it." I'm going to repeat that last part because it's very important. It was created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden since time immemorial. And so the mystery of what it means to be a human person is communicated in and through the body. Is communicated through that. And so when you think about what's a sacrament? Catholics, we have our sacraments. What is the sacrament itself? Okay, some of you are my teachers. It is a what sign of a what reality? Yeah, thank you. Very good. So it's a visible sign that gives kind of an invisible grace. In the same way, we can kind of talk about the sacramentality of the body, that the body is the visible sign of my invisible soul. You would not know that my soul is here without my body. In the same way, I can't, I would be sitting here by myself if there were just souls here but no bodies. Your bodies make known to me your souls. And so, because of that unique relationship, the Pope understands that from the beginning, this is a good thing, and this is something why we can have a theology of the body, why we can have these things. But we must not separate them. Even though they are distinct, body and soul are distinct, they cannot be separated. Similar to like the natures of Christ. He is both God and man, but he is not one above the other. He is not, part God, part man, anything like that. He is both. Unique, distinct, but inseparable. You cannot separate them. Original harmony. This is the best way to understand what it was like before the fall. So when we talk about what Adam and Eve experienced before the fall, original harmony are the key words there. What do we mean by that? Before the fall, there was perfect harmony. Everything was in tune between God and man, between man and himself, between man and others, and man and the creation around him. So we're going to look at these four aspects of that original harmony. And remember, our goal here is, next week we're going to talk about the fall. And so our goal here is to kind of get kind of the picture of what it was like before the fall. What was the experience of Adam and Eve? I mean, remember, they were naked and not ashamed. Well, what does that mean? And so keep that in the back of your mind, that we want to get to that original experience before the fall. So that relationship between man and God. And Genesis talks about that God walked in the garden in the cool of the day. And this kind of points to kind of that relational aspect that man had with God in the beginning, that they conversed regularly. They were kind of in this very familiar relationship. I mean, walking in the cool of the day. I mean, it sounds like, I'm going to go take a walk with my wife and my kids or something like that. It's very kind of familiar. And so we understand from the beginning that God and man had this familiar relationship, had this, what the church calls, this state of grace, this right relationship, this harmony fitting together. Everything was in tune. The Creator and the creature were walking together in step. Man and himself. That one's, God and man, that one's pretty easily understandable. But when we get into these other ones, This is where we start to get into that fuller experience of what it was like before the fall. So man in himself. There was no temptation from within man. Temptation had to come from outside of man. That's why we have the snake. You know, I could, you know, if you see somebody drop a $100 bill on the side of the road, some of you, probably sitting over here, younger crowd, I don't know about you older, maybe, would have that initial thing, probably because you're poor, like every college student is. Your first thing is, ooh, $100 for me. You know, you have that initial, I could take that. He didn't even notice it drop. You know, and I could take that. You know, that temptation comes from within us. That temptation to do something deliberate that we know is wrong. You know, St. Augustine talks about this in his Confessions when his friends, I forget what they steal, pears or apples or something. He's like, we weren't hungry. We weren't going to like give them to the poor or anything, but we just stole them. Like, he was kind of reflecting on this experience of concupiscence, that he knew it was wrong, and he just did it anyway. This was not the case before the fall. That temptation just to do something for the sake of doing something was not there. And so there was not that internal conflict in man. Yeah, he had a choice, but he had that choice with full knowledge. And so, which we'll see, it's one of what's called the preternatural gifts that was lost with original sin, that man lost that knowledge. And so he had that knowledge, he had a choice, and he made the choice and stuff. But when they were tempted, that temptation had to come from outside of man, hence the snake. The relationship between man and others. This relationship is a little more complex. It is both because as a person, I am not only an object speaking to you, but I'm also a subject receiving you. The way right now you are looking at me, I am looking at you. Both of us right now are both playing the role of object and subject. And so when we understand this from the beginning, we understand that Adam and Eve both saw each other with perfect vision, and they were seen by the other with the same perfect vision. And it's important to note that the body communicated the soul perfectly. The beauty of the body, the dignity of the soul, the dignity of God's creation was perfectly communicated in and through the body. Not only was it perfectly communicated, but by the other, it was perfectly seen. And we'll see what happens to this after the fall. That both in being seen and seeing the other person, these relationships get mixed up. Our bodies do not perfectly communicate our soul. Not only that, but someone looking at another person, even if their body communicated it perfectly, they would not look at the other person with that perfect love, with that perfect dignity. And so we have these two kind of elements here. We reflect God in our likeness by the way we see. Adam and Eve saw each other like God saw them. That's what the likeness was. When it talks about man was made in the image and likeness. They were made in the image in that they reflected God, and they were like God in that they saw each other perfectly. They saw each other with perfect love. As we'll see, this gets destroyed. John Paul II writes, he says, "This seeing each other is not just a participation in the exterior perception of the world. It is also an interior dimension of participation in the vision of the Creator himself." So when we talk about how does God give us a participation in creation? From the beginning, in the beginning, part of that participation was seeing creation. Adam and Eve saw creation like God saw it. That vision of which the Elohist text speaks several times, God saw everything that He had made, and behold, it was very good. Adam and Eve had that same beholding. Behold, they beheld the same. So, remember those two aspects in that relationship with others. It was not just in their communication of themselves, but also in the seeing of the other person. Man and creation. Genesis 1:28 says, "Be fruitful and multiply, subdue the earth and have dominion over it." This was kind of the charge that God gave that first couple. In Genesis 2:15, He gives Adam a specific job to till and keep. And another way of understanding that is guard. And so when you talk about guarding the Garden of Eden, how did the snake get in? And so that's why even most of the time, even though Eve was the one that ate the apple, how did the snake get in? Did Adam do his job of guarding Eden? Did he do his job of tilling and keeping it? No. And so this relationship that man, so there, I've just vindicated all the women. Yeah, I knew it was their fault. That's right.
Talking about separating the body and soul, it's kind of getting a little scary.
Yeah. Good. The thing to recognize here with that relationship between man and creation is that man was not subject to the earth, but the earth was subject to him. And we'll see the full effects of this after the fall. But from the beginning, we can see how these four relationships between God and man and himself, man and each other, and man and creation, how all of these relationships that man experienced, they were in perfect harmony. They were working together with clarity. They were working together with love and kind of everything the way that God designed it. This was God's original plan for man and God's original plan for life. How did man seek to find meaning in this life? Through being a gift. Jesus began by looking at his Father's original plan in that Matthew story. He said, from the beginning it was not so. He goes back to his Father's plan. Remember, the reason why Jesus came was to do his Father's will. And so he comes to show us what it was like, what we are called to. He's saying that, especially when we look at, Moses, and they say, Moses allowed the people to get divorced. And Jesus says, no, I'm calling you to something higher. Why? Because, and Jesus doesn't just say, I'm going to call you to something higher and leave you to your own devices. He says, no, I will call you to something higher, but I'm going to give you my grace. I'm going to give you the Holy Spirit, which we see working in and through the church for the rest of history, in and through the sacraments. So it's not that Jesus calls us to something higher and then bolts. He calls us to something higher and gives us the grace to accomplish that. And in much of Jesus' sayings, he begins with that. It has been said, then he'll say something, then he says, but I say to you. And so he calls those people continually to something higher. The experience of Adam and Eve as naked and not ashamed. This means that they were radically free to give themselves. Not just physically. So when we think of kind of when you think of nakedness, you kind of think of, just being free of clothes. Okay, that's fine. But we need to think of nakedness as something a little more interior as well. That they were free from everything that we struggle with. They were free of all that. And so they were able to make that gift of themselves, not just of their bodies, but of their entire person. One of the things that we strive for as Catholics, especially, is kind of that gift of, or the fruit of the Holy Spirit, the self-mastery. to master ourselves, so as to make a gift of ourselves. Like, that the maxim, I cannot give what I do not have. I cannot give you this book if I do not have it. In the same way, I cannot give you myself if I do not possess myself. If I'm a slave to drugs or alcohol or anything like that, if I'm a slave to any of that stuff, I cannot make a gift to myself. Why? Because it's already somewhere else. And so, Adam and Eve, they had this perfect possession of self. They are male and female complementary in creation, created that perfect gift, created that perfect environment for them to give themselves to each other. They were created for that union. The two became one. And like Christ says, referring back to Genesis, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. And so we're not just talking about necessarily there at what God has joined together in the sacrament of marriage or in marriage, but kind of God's original plan for man and woman was to be in union with each other. And so what God's original plan was, let no man put asunder. So don't just think of necessarily the sacrament of marriage, but think about God's plan there. This was a specific kind of love that is uniquely fruitful in the creation and life. And this is something we'll get more on when we get to some of the other talks, talking about the fruitfulness of marriage, the fruitfulness of the union, that it is something that is unique and participates in the creation of God. The human person finds their meaning through this sincere gift. And again, how do we understand that? Where do we even begin? What does that mean, a sincere gift in itself? I think a good place to start is the way that the Pope started. Begin with the person of Jesus Christ. Always begin there. You can never go wrong. His perfect obedience to the Father was possible because he did it in complete freedom. As God, he was perfect. He completely possessed himself. And he said, I'm going to become like you in everything except for sin. He did that in his complete freedom. And he said, I'm going to offer that back to my Father. His self-possession, because he had that, he was able to offer it. And so in the person of Christ, not only do we see Christ the high priest, the one offering, but we see the perfect offering. He makes himself not only the offering, but the one who is offering. And so, and that's why the Mass is the most perfect prayer, because it's Christ who is both the sacrifice and the priest. And so, and that's why as Catholics, we strive to master ourselves so we can have complete possession of ourselves to make a gift of ourselves. And so that's why, as Catholics, we hold everything in great importance. Our work's important. Yes, absolutely. Do we need to go out and serve the poor? Yes, absolutely. Do we need to go and pray and worship our God? Absolutely. All of these things are important. Why? Because all of those relationships, like we talked about, man and God, ourselves, man and each other, man and creation, all of these relationships are severely wounded. And we're trying to live with all of these things in balance. We're trying to live with God's view. Because Christ came and said, here's what it was like in the beginning. And so we take what Christ did, we take what Christ said, and we put it into practice. We put it into motion. And so this is what Christ tells us what it was like in the beginning. So it's not that we'll ever be able to live that here on earth, but with the grace of God, with the grace of Jesus Christ, through the sacraments, we can live that to some degree. We will fall. We have the sacrament of confession. His grace is always there. And so from the beginning, we can see how God has made creation, what his plan was for life, what his plan was for male and female, and how they find meaning in life. They found meaning by making a gift of themselves to each other. But as we know, as the story continues, we know it doesn't always stay that way. And so Next time we'll talk about the fall and what's called historical man.